Margaret Maggie Lawson never imagined her quiet life at 56 would become a battlefield over the very home that raised her. Sitting alone in her Savannah, Georgia office that crisp autumn morning, she gazed at an old framed photo of her late husband Frank and their only son, Ethan. Her heart swelled with a bittersweet ache. It had been 12 long years since Frank passed from a sudden heart attack, leaving Maggie to navigate life's storms with only Ethan as her anchor. But Maggie wasn't one to crumble. She poured her grief into building a small yet thriving property management business, managing a handful of rental homes while keeping her late mother's Charleston house as her personal sanctuary. That Charleston house was more than brick and mortar, with its grand porch wrapped in climbing roses and the faint scent of lemon balm lingering from her mother's old kitchen window garden. It held her childhood whispers, Sunday dinners, and silent prayers. It was the place she ran to after Frank died, clutching Ethan close, and the place where she first felt whole again. She always believed this house would be the legacy she left to Ethan when he was ready to build his own life. But Maggie never could have foreseen how the woman her son brought home would turn that legacy into a battleground of betrayal and heartbreak, testing everything she thought she knew about family love and loyalty. For Maggie, her son Ethan had always been her greatest pride. At 29, he was finally finding his footing after years of drifting through part-time jobs and short-lived gigs. When he called her one crisp Tuesday afternoon, his voice trembling with hope as he spoke of wanting a fresh start, Maggie felt her heart bloom with relief. He spoke of dreams bigger than his cramped apartment, dreams of a place that felt like home. Without hesitation, Maggie offered him the Charleston house. "Come stay here, Ethan," Shed said softly, over the phone, her eyes misting as she glanced out at the oak trees swaying beyond her office window. "You don't need to pay rent. Fix it up if you want. And when you're ready, well, figure out the next steps together." On the other end of the line, Ethan's silence broke into quiet tears. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. In that moment, Maggie felt like her heart might burst from the fierce love she carried for him. She could almost see little Ethan again, tugging on her apron for a cookie, the sunlight catching his sandy hair as Frank ruffled it playfully. Handing him the keys to that house was one of the proudest moments of her life. It was more than giving him a place to sleep. It was giving him roots, a chance to build his future on the foundation of their family's past. But Maggie never imagined that when Ethan walked through that front door to start his new chapter, he'd bring with him a woman who would turn their family's home and their bond into something unrecognizable. The first time Maggie met Brooke, Ethan's girlfriend, it was over a rushed dinner Ethan hosted to introduce them. Brooke had striking hazel eyes and a polished way of speaking, every syllable delivered with careful poise. She carried herself like someone who had memorized her lines in life's performance, each smile calculated and each glance curated for effect. At first, Maggie felt relieved. Ethan deserved someone who cared for him, someone who would steady him as he found his way. But beneath Brooke's perfectly shaped brows and delicate laugh, there was something Maggie couldn't quite place. A flicker of coldness, perhaps. A silent verdict written behind her practiced charm. Brooke moved into this Charleston house quickly, too quickly for Maggie's comfort. Within weeks, she was answering the door with a casual authority that made Maggie pause. One Saturday morning, Maggie drove over with a fresh peach cobbler in her hands, eager to surprise Ethan. But when she rang the doorbell, Brooke opened the door with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Oh, you didn't call first," Brooke said, blinking as if Maggie's presence had thrown off her carefully curated plans for the day. "I didn't think I needed to," Maggie replied softly, raising the cobbler as a peace offering. "Just wanted to see how y'all were settling in." Brooke's gaze flickered to the Tupperware dish before returning to Maggie with cool dismissal. "We're fine. Just busy with some things. She didn't invite her in." That night, Ethan called to apologize, his voice small and tired. "Brooke's just particular about her space, Mom," he mumbled. "She's trying to create a new energy in the house." Maggie forced a quiet laugh, but as she set the phone down, a chill prickled down her spine. Something about Brooke's presence felt like a slow, silent shifting of the earth beneath her feet, a change she couldn't control brewing far deeper than freshly painted walls or redecorated rooms. Weeks passed, and Maggie noticed subtle changes each time she visited. It began with small things. Her grandmother's hand-stitched quilt, once draped lovingly over the banister, was gone without a word. The old rocking chair where Maggie's mother used to sit and knit by the window had vanished, replaced by a minimalist white stool that looked like it belonged in a sterile hotel lobby. Even the worn oak dining table, scarred by decades of Thanksgiving feasts and Sunday breakfasts, had been swapped out for a sleek glass rectangle with cold steel legs. One afternoon, while Ethan was out, Maggie asked Brooke where the quilt had gone. Brooke didn't even look up from her phone as she answered, "Oh, I packed it away." It didn't match the aesthetic we're going for. There was that word again, aesthetic. As if the life built within those walls meant nothing compared to a trending Pinterest board. Maggie tried to keep her voice calm. "That quilt has been in our family for 4 generations. My grandmother sewed it when she was carrying my mama." Brooke shrugged lightly, her manicured fingers scrolling endlessly. "Well, Ethan said I could redecorate how I see fit. It's our house now, Maggie. We're building our future here." Those words struck deeper than any insult. "Our house." Maggie felt her breath catch in her throat as she looked around. The soft blue curtains her mother had sewn by hand were gone. The family portraits that once lined the hallway walls were replaced with stark, abstract prints that seemed void of any soul. Each visit felt like entering a museum curated by a stranger who saw her family's memories as clutter to be discarded. That night, as Maggie lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow and silent above her, tears slid down her temples. She wondered if Ethan saw what was happening, if he realized that with every rug replaced and every antique packed away, Brooke wasn't just redecorating. She was erasing the very heart of their home. One Saturday morning, driven by an uneasy sense that something was terribly wrong, Maggie decided to stop by the Charleston house to retrieve old mortgage documents she had left in the study years ago. She texted Ethan to let him know she'd be coming by, but there was no response. As she parked under the familiar magnolia tree and walked up the front steps, her stomach tightened with dread. Using her own key, she let herself in, expecting to be greeted by warmth and the faint lemon balm scent from her mother's old kitchen garden. Instead, she stepped into an empty silence that pressed down on her chest like a weight. The house felt cold, stripped of its soul. The family photos were gone, replaced by sterile black and white art. Maggie walked slowly through the living room, her eyes scanning the walls, pausing at the spot where a faded portrait of her parents used to hang. She continued to the study, only to find that the small drawer she had used for decades to store important family documents had disappeared. In its place stood a white vanity table, cluttered with expensive makeup ring lights and vlogging equipment. Panic rose in her throat as she searched the room, opening cabinets and closets with trembling hands. Her family's records were nowhere to be found. Then on the desk, she noticed Brooke's open laptop. The screen displayed an online listing under the name Brooke's Luxe Home Finds. Maggie's breath caught as she scrolled through the page. There, listed for sale at $750, was her mother's Tiffany-style lamp. She kept scrolling, her eyes blurring with tears. Her father's military flag in its protective frame, the silver cutlery set reserved for Christmas dinners, and paintings that had once graced their foyer. Each photograph of a listed item felt like a punch to her chest. Her knees nearly buckled as she whispered to the empty room, "She's selling our family piece by piece, In that moment, surrounded by glaring ring lights and stolen memories turned into price tags, Maggie felt the deepest betrayal of her life. Brooke hadn't just erased their past. She was profiting from it, from the very legacy that Maggie had spent her life protecting. Maggie's hands were still trembling when she heard the front door open downstairs. She stood frozen in the study, anger pulsing through her veins alongside disbelief and grief. Brooke's voice floated up the staircase, casual and expectant. "Ethan, is that you?" she called out, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors. When she stepped into the room and saw Maggie standing there, her smile vanished like morning mist burned away by the sun. "What are you doing here?" Brooke snapped, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "I came for some documents," Maggie replied, her voice low but steady. She lifted her chin, refusing to cower. "Where's Ethan?" Brooke's lips curled into a smirk. "He's out with friends." "Why?" Maggie closed the laptop with trembling fingers and faced her daughter-in-law squarely. "Does Ethan know you've been selling our family heirlooms online? My father's military flag, my mother's lamp, things that belonged to people who built this home before you were ever in his life." Brooke's eyes narrowed, flicking with something dark and calculating. "They're Ethan's now," she said coldly. "And he gave me permission." "That's funny," Maggie replied, reaching into her purse and pulling out a folded deed, its edges worn soft from decades of handling. She held it up between them like a sword gleaming in the morning light. "Because the title to this house is still in my name. Ethan's here because I love him. I never transferred ownership. This is my house, Brooke. Those heirlooms weren't his to give away." For the first time, Brooke's composure cracked. Her arms dropped to her sides, and her painted lips parted in silent shock. Maggie's voice trembled with fury and heartbreak as she continued. "You may have replaced the furniture, sold the photos, and hidden away every quilt and letter that carried our memories, but you will not erase me from my own home." The air between them felt electric with truth, finally spoken. Maggie stood taller than she had in years, her grief transforming into strength with every breath. Brooke's silence was louder than any shouted denial, and in that silence Maggie knew the war for her family's legacy had only just begun. 20 minutes later, Ethan walked through the front door with a tired smile, holding a takeout bag in one hand. But the moment he saw Maggie and Brooke standing across from each other in the living room, their faces taut with tension, his shoulders tensed. "What's going on here?" he asked, glancing nervously between them. Brooke was the first to speak, her voice dripping with forced innocence. "Your mother broke into the house," she said, folding her arms defiantly. "She went through my laptop, accused me of theft, and claims she owns this place." Maggie didn't flinch. She turned to Ethan, her eyes clear, but filled with quiet sorrow. "You didn't tell her the truth, did you?" Ethan's face paled. "What truth, Mom?" he asked weakly. Maggie reached into her purse and pulled out the folded deed, again, smoothing it open on the marble coffee table. "This is the deed to this house, Ethan," she said softly. "Your grandmother left it to me. You've been staying here rent-free because I wanted you to have a fresh start. But you never told Brooke that, did you?" Brooke's expression twisted into rage as she turned to Ethan. "You lied to me," she spat, her voice breaking. "You let me think this was ours." Ethan's shoulders slumped under the weight of her words. I didn't want to ruin anything," he whispered, his voice cracking with shame. At that moment, the doorbell rang sharply, echoing through the hollowed-out living room. Brooke stiffened. "Who is that?" she demanded, but Maggie walked calmly to the door and opened it to reveal 2 uniformed officers. "Good evening," said Officer Daniels, his deep voice polite but firm. "We received a call about a civil dispute regarding property ownership." Brooke's eyes darted between them, panic flashing as Maggie handed the officers her documents, the deed, family records, and printed listings from Brooke's online sales. Officer Daniels flipped through them with a slow nod. "Ma'am," he said, looking at Brooke legally, "Miss Lawson owns this property. Her name isn't on any lease or deed here." Brooke's face drained of color as the truth settled like iron around her neck. Maggie stood tall, her chest aching with grief and relief all at once, knowing this battle was far from over, but her voice, her memories, and her family's legacy would not be erased today. The living room felt frozen in time as Brooke stood trembling, her fists clenched at her sides. The officers remained calm and silent, their presence filling the hollow space where family laughter once echoed. Ethan sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands, as guilt rippled off him like heat from asphalt on a summer road. Brooke turned to him, her voice sharp and desperate. "Are you going to let her do this to us?" She hissed, her eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and glossy with tears. For the first time, his gaze was clear. I think you already did this to yourself," he whispered, his words trembling but resolute. Brooke stepped back as if struck, her painted lips parted in silent shock. Officer Daniels shifted slightly, his boots creaking against the polished wood floors. "Miss Lawson," he said softly to Maggie, "do you wish for her to leave the premises tonight?" Maggie hesitated, feeling the ache deep in her chest. The ache of a mother who never wanted this battle, only peace and remembrance for those who came before her. She took a long, shaking breath. "Yes," she said quietly. "She needs to leave." Brooke let out a strangled noise, part sob, part snarl, as she rushed past Ethan and stormed upstairs. Minutes later, she reappeared with an overnight bag, her heels clacking angrily against the hardwood, as she brushed past Maggie without so much as a glance. The officers followed her out, leaving behind a heavy silence that settled over the house like dusk. Ethan sat there unmoving, staring at the floor where shards of his choices lay scattered and sharp. Maggie lowered herself beside him, her knees aching with the years, and gently laid a hand on his back. "I never wanted it to come to this," she whispered, her voice thick with tears she refused to let fall. Ethan's shoulders shook under her touch. "I know, Mom," he whispered back, his voice small and childlike again. "I'm so sorry." And in that quiet living room, stripped of its photos and memories, mother and son sat together, the only two souls left to piece back what mattered most, family truth, and the love that even betrayal could not steal away. The days that followed felt like waking from a long, restless nightmare. Maggie and Ethan moved through the quiet Charleston house, like gentle ghosts, their footsteps echoing on bare floors once warmed by family gatherings and children's laughter. Together they began the slow, deliberate work of restoring what Brooke had tried to erase. Early one morning, while a humid Carolina breeze rustled the magnolia trees outside, Ethan pulled down a dusty box from the attic. He set it on the old oak dining table, the same table Maggie had retrieved from storage to replace Brooke's cold glass rectangle. Inside the box were photo albums, brittle letters tied with faded blue ribbon, and her mother's church cookbooks stained with years of lemon curd and blackberry preserves. Maggie's hands trembled as she lifted each item out, tears blurring her vision. Ethan pulled out a Polaroid of himself as a toddler, frosting smeared across his cheeks, his father Frank standing behind him with a grin so wide it lit up the whole room. "I don't even remember this birthday," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. "You were 2, Maggie said softly, tracing her finger across Frank's smiling face. "Your daddy dropped the cake, remember? We salvaged what we could, and you thought it was the best day in the world." They sat side by side at the table, flipping through photographs of Sunday cookouts. Thanksgiving prayers and Ethan's first day of school, his hair sticking up in every direction. The sadness in their hearts felt lighter with every memory they unearthed. It was as if the house itself was breathing again, sighing with relief, as pieces of its soul returned to the rooms that once held love loss and unbreakable bonds. That evening, they rehung the family portraits along the hallway. Maggie watched Ethan climb the small ladder, steadying it with her aching hands. When he stepped down, he turned to her with tears streaming freely down his face. "Thank you, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for never giving up on me or on this home." Maggie smiled through her tears, the golden porch light catching the silver strands in her hair. "It's not just a house, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling with love. "It's who we are." In the weeks that followed, Maggie and Ethan worked quietly to ensure the Charleston house would never again become a battleground for greed or manipulation. One late afternoon, as cicadas hummed outside and the sun set in amber streaks beyond the magnolia branches, they sat at the dining table with Maggie's attorney. Papers were spread out before them, trust documents, deed transfers, and protective clauses written with precision and love. "I want this house protected," Maggie said firmly, her fingers pressed to the table's scarred wood. "No matter what happens in the future, no one should ever treat this place like a transaction again." Ethan nodded beside her, his posture straight and resolute. "I agree, Mom," he said softly, his eyes shining with tears he didn't bother to hide. "This is your sanctuary, Grandma's legacy. One day, if I have a family, I want my kids to know exactly where they came from, who they came from." After signing the documents, they walked out onto the front porch together, the wood creaking under their combined weight, just like it had when Ethan was little, and Frank held him up to touch the porch light fixture. They watched as fireflies blinked to life across the yard, flickering like tiny lanterns in the deepening twilight. Ethan turned to Maggie, his voice hushed with emotion. "You know, I thought having a modern house with glass tables and marble floors meant success," he said, shaking his head with a sad chuckle. "But none of that mattered. The laughter, the stories, the smell of peach cobbler in the kitchen. This is home." Maggie reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Things can always be replaced," she whispered, her voice trembling with both sorrow and hope. "But our memories, our love, our family, that's what makes these walls a home." As the evening breeze lifted her hair and carried the scent of gardenias across the porch, Maggie felt something she hadn't in months: peace. She closed her eyes, listening to the cicadas' song, knowing her family's story would continue here, safely guarded by the unbreakable bonds of truth, dignity, and love. Months later, as autumn leaves painted the Charleston yard in russet and gold, Maggie sat on the porch with Ethan sipping sweet tea, while the scent of baking cornbread drifted from the kitchen. The house was alive again. Photos lined the hallway. Her mother's quilt hung proudly over the banister. Even Ethan seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer burdened by guilt, but strengthened with purpose. One evening, as they watched fireflies dance across the yard, Ethan turned to her, eyes glistening in the porch light. "Thank you for never giving up on me, Mom," he whispered, his voice raw. Maggie smiled softly, squeezing his hand. "That's what family does, Ethan. We protect each other and the memories that made us who we are. In life, there will always be people who try to erase your worth or rewrite your story to fit their plans. But true strength comes from knowing where you come from, standing firm in your truth, and guarding the legacies that shaped you. Love, dignity, and family. These are life's real treasures, far more precious than polished marble or fleeting status. If this story touched your heart, tell us, have you ever stood up to protect your family's legacy or your own dignity? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in stories that remind us of who we truly are, Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss more powerful true stories of love, justice, and resilience.